not make as much sense when we get later on in the presentation. So I definitely welcome those as we go. And again, I'm the range specialist based out of the Corpus Christi Research and Extension Center, but I imagine I've seen most of you before in my travels because I definitely cover all of your counties. So the first thing we're going to talk about is setting your goals, which is always kind of a more difficult thing to talk about with ranchers who have been doing likely the same thing for generations on their property. And so to stop and set goals sometimes seems like a waste of time, but I think there's good reason that we might want to think about this. So my goal today is simply to convince you that written goals are not for sissies, because if you have written goals, that is more of a plan. When you have goals in your head, I think those are more of a dream. And dreams are extremely important for making successful ranching operations. In fact, ranchers are some of the most riskiest people that I know, because agriculture in general is very risky. But to know that you are risking something takes a really solid plan to make sure that you're financially stable in doing that. So what do you think? You can type in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and say it. What do you think the most common answer is when I ask people, what is your goal for your property? What do you think they tell me?
Make money.
To make money? Anybody else have a guess?
Profit.
Profit? That is exactly right. So you've either seen my presentation before or you hit it right on the head. They want to make a profit. And you know, as a range specialist, I really want to help people choose the right management options for their place, but to make a profit is not specific enough for me to know if some practice that I'm suggesting for you is actually needed for your place or even applicable. So it's very important that we have specific goals. So more realistic goals. They can be a lot of variation, but what I need is for you to think through what you want to do, and that might even vary by pasture. So some people want to say raise cattle for profit while maintaining prime wildlife habitat for leasing. So that would indicate that yes, you want to have your cattle operation and you want to be making money, but you're also very concerned with keeping good wildlife because maybe you're very interested in hunting them, or maybe you're also making income from leasing out wildlife hunting or ecotourism like wildlife photography. Another thing you could do is maybe raise cattle for maximum long-term profit and just maintain your wildlife for hunting, like friends or family thing. So that's still a component in your management, but cattle might take first priority. So we know then when we're giving you management suggestions that we're giving you something that matches your long-term goal because you're really interested in maintaining a profit off your cattle. Main thing. Also, you might manage for specific species like quail, if that's something that you either enjoy or you're finding that you're making a lot of money off of, or dove, whatever it is that you seem to be making a little extra income from. Or you might think about by pasture. So we all have those pastures that incessantly grow brush, or they always seem to be weedy, no matter what our grazing practices are. And in those cases, those soils and that those different ecotypes might be just prone to that. And so there may be certain pastures you want to manage more for forage productivity for your livestock, and other pastures that you would rather manage for wildlife because that makes more sense and it's not fighting the system as much. So when we talk about written goals, there's a few things you have to think about. Like I said, definitely written. If they're not written, then that's not a business plan. And I think instead of thinking about our ranches more like as a hobby, we ought to start thinking about them a lot more as a business, because they are a serious business. And we want to keep those businesses profitable so that we can turn those over to the next generation in a good state. And they need to be specific, like those examples that we just went through. They also need to be reasonable, so they have to match your resources that you have on that place. And then what's really important is that when people write things down, they feel like that's committing them to something. And that's not necessarily true. So these different goals should be considered adaptable over time. You might want to revisit them at the end of a season, or you might want to revisit them at the end of the year. And then you can say if you're successful or not. But the most important thing next to writing them down is to have objectives. Your objectives are something measurable that you can come back to at the end of the year and say if you were successful or not. The problem with using profitability as our only objective is that some years you're going to make an investment in your land, and you and I know that that is a long-term investment. So let's say you did major brush control. You did an aerial application of lots of acres. That's going to cost you a lot of money. But we know that long-term, you're investing in the productivity of that land that's going to grow more grass for your livestock and be a lot better for your operation in future years. So it's not fair to say for that year you were a failure, because inevitably you're actually improving your place. So your objectives are more like to decrease brush canopy cover by 30%, or to increase your calf crop by 10%. And then that is something tangible at the end of the year that you can come back and say, did I or did I not meet my objectives that directly impact the goal for that land? So if your land is to mainly maintain profitable cattle operations and you increased your calf crop by 10% through different practices that you adopted from what Dr. Pascal told you in the last session, then you were indeed successful, and you can revisit how you might want to tweak those for the next year to maintain that momentum in a positive direction for your place. So let's talk about the big picture. So when we talk about landscapes and rangeland, we're talking mainly about 3 different types of plants: your brush, your woodies, your browse, your trees on your place, your grasses, which have long linear leaves that are mainly produced for livestock production, but also very valuable in many instances for cover and food for wildlife, and then your forbs or your weeds. And those are a component that a lot of times ranchers think about decreasing, but in fact, cattle eat a fairly large amount of forbs in a day. And so not all forbs are necessarily bad. In fact, mixed into the landscape can make your land very valuable from both a livestock and a wildlife standpoint. Furthermore, we're talking about different species that we're managing for on our property. Species, by the simplest definition, is a group of individuals that can interbreed and they produce viable offspring. So what's an example of something that does not produce? It can interbreed, but it does not produce a viable offspring. Any thoughts? You're like, I got comfortable in my chair and I'm not leaning forward to type in. Mule, yeah, okay, I heard somebody say mule. Mule is a great example. So that's something that, yeah, you can interbreed a horse and donkey. You get a really awesome product, a mule, but they therefore cannot breed. So they're different species. So a population is all of these species living in one area. So the same with plants. That's all those plants that are living in that same area that are the same species. Those are a population. But a community is all of the plants and animals in that area, defined area together. And so the community is how all of these things start interacting on your property, and it makes it a little more confusing when you start managing, because you have to consider a lot of different aspects. And furthermore, we talk about ecosystems. Ecosystems are communities where plants and animals are interacting with their abiotic or their non-living environment. So you've got your soil, very important, air, water, and sunlight that are all helping to create whatever environment you want for a most productive rangeland. And so you can think about that kind of like a mall. So a mall is like a bunch of different communities that work together to provide different things in the habitat. So you might have a food court providing really good food, even though you have got food spaces trickled in throughout the mall. All of these stores are different opportunities too to get different things and to use for that animal's production. But when we talk about managing, a lot of times we talk about managing on a landscape level. So how does your management on your piece of property, whether you own 10 acres or 10,000, how does your management on that property fit into the bigger picture? And that's where we have interacting ecosystems that work for the greater good of producing those services that you're interested to meet your goals that you've already defined. So that's a lot like having different ecosystems within an area that make up an entire community. So you're talking about stores interacting with different neighborhoods. Those are things that you can think about in your head as, how do these different things around me even play into what management I might decide for my property? So when we talk about vegetative cover, and that's what we're managing for, is our desirable vegetative cover, we're talking about it from 2 different aspects. One is the amount of vegetation. So that's literally how much forage do you have for your livestock? Easy to calculate. That's not something that's brain science. So when we talk about the top picture, that's very little forage as compared to the bottom picture, which might be like our Thanksgiving meals. Lots of different food available. That's the amount of forage. Now, when we talk about species composition, I love donuts, but donuts are not necessarily nutritious. That's not going to provide everything that my body needs to be at its best, like that balanced dinner, steak dinner that you see on the bottom. So what's important with the species is that we have the right species there. I've had people tell me that their cattle are in poor condition, but they can't understand it because they have so many they have so much grass on their place. And when I drive by, I notice it's like a lot of 3-on, which is not a productive grass for livestock. In fact, those seeds get stuck in their gums. That's not healthy for them to even try to eat that. But we have to think about what species we have and which ones we're most interested in managing for. So we're not managing for all the plants that are on your plate. We're managing for those that are most beneficial to meet your goals that you've set. So the forage aspect of plants has two components too. One is the nutritive value. So that's how digestible is that forage and at what stage is it? Because of course, as it gets taller and stemmier, it's not going to be quite as digestible as it was when it was young. What nutrients does it provide? What's the crude protein level? These are things, lignin level, that's like the cell wall or the stemminess of the plant that's not beneficial. What if we send off this forage to a lab? That tells us our nutritional value of that forage. But we also have the quality, which takes into consideration the intake or how much of that they can take in. And that has a lot more to do with digestibility, availability even on our place. How good is that forage at providing whatever nutrients that animal is going to need? So when we talk about livestock diet, of course, cattle eat a lot of grass. That's not debatable. They take in a lot of grass, but they also take in a lot of forbs. So if you think about, even in this example, 12% forbs, when you think about a typical cow eating, say, 31 pounds of forage a day, that's quite a bit of poundage of forbs that they're also taking in. And then, of course, cattle will eat a little bit of browse, although not much. When you compare that to sheep, for example, sheep with tinier mouths, they need higher nutrition. They don't have the large body size like a cow to take in that much food and be able to gain all the nutrients from it. So they're looking for a little bit better diet. So they still eat a lot of grass, but they increase their amount of forbs and brush that they'll take in. And then when we talk about a goat, it gets even more extreme. Goats will pretty much eat anything. You've probably experienced that if you have goats. They can really diversify their diet depending on what's available. So on the other flip side, when we talk about wildlife diet, we're talking about them needing specific things, mainly brush and forbs. So wildlife don't eat a lot of grass, although they do use that in their landscape as cover. Or you'll see some birds go by and just strip all the seeds off of vegetation. You also might see deer grazing, say like right after prescribed burn, when that new green forage is growing. Whenever it's small and very nutritious, they can take some of that in then. But if you think about the body types of deer as compared to cattle, you can see right off that they're not going to be able to take in a large amount of really poor roughage like our cows can do and turn that into something tasty like a steak. So they're really talented at doing that. Deer need a little bit different diet, although they can take advantage depending on the season of more browse or less browse, depending on how much forb is available. And then quail and turkey, you can kind of think of them as similar animals in that they can diversify. They eat a lot of seeds. They rely a lot on insects in South Texas, especially since it's warm most of the year. That really can boost their nutrition level. And they might take in a little bit of greens, but it's kind of debatable if they actually need those greens or if they're just a byproduct of other things they're trying to pick up at the time. So the only time we have competition really is when we have limited resources. And competition is driven by less plant diversity, so less things available during that time period, or too many animals. Those are both things that we can regulate. The too many animals is very obvious. You can lower your stocking rate, you can take out more deer, but less plant diversity is something that we can start to manage for. And oftentimes we do that by suppressing these plants that are growing out of balance with the other thing. I call them not playing well with others. When they kind of become the dominant ones in the landscape, we can suppress them, or push them back so that we can hopefully bring on more plants with more diversity that do play well with others in that plant community like we talked about. So why do we manage rangelands? I'd just like to touch on this because a lot of people might argue with you that you should let your land be natural. Well, we've kind of messed all of that up when we created this system where we put up fences and we have to regulate the grazing on our lands. And now we're using our best available knowledge to try to imply some sort of conscious human intervention to make competing choices. And so that's why having your written goals is the number one thing that we start out with, because once you have those goals, these decisions become a lot easier. So have you ever really struggled with the decision of whether or not you're going to treat a plant that seems to be growing in too much abundance on your place, and you're just not sure if you should spend the money on that or not? If you had your goals written out and you know the best available knowledge about that plant and what it could provide on your landscape, then it's a little bit easier to use this value system to make your judgments. So I'm really, really proud to be in range management because it's based on two principles that you ranchers live by. That's number one, to protect and better our soil and vegetation. Because we know if we don't, then long term, we're going to have issues to where our operation cannot be as productive as it once was. And number two is to maintain or improve the output of useful products. And so that is what we're doing whenever we're applying any of these management practices that I'm going to cover today. So the first thing you have to do, not the first thing, obviously the third thing you have to do is identify your plants. Because if we start talking about how to treat these plants, but you're not specifically sure which one you've got, like Marco often gets questions about what is this? And then what's your second question, Marco, after you identify what plant it is? He's like, not gonna lean it. Go ahead. Yeah, how do I control it? So if Marco can identify that, then he can tell them if that plant is beneficial or not. A lot of times if people already notice that it's growing too abundantly and kind of taking over an area, then likely it's not, or else your livestock would have already been utilizing this. But it is important to know what it is, because our application or how we would apply the tools in our range management toolbox are going to vary depending on what specific plant that is. So how do we identify the plants? The first place I always send people, and probably one of the places that Marco visits often, is our range plants database. This was created long before I was ever a range specialist, and it's found at rangeplants.tamu.edu. It is a website that has 400 and something of the most common plants, both are all brush, weeds, and grass species that we often get questions about. And there's a really nice little help me identify my plant button right there. And when you click on that, it's going to take you to a website that has a lot of different characteristics where you can start to narrow down that plant that you have. So if you're lucky enough to have a flower color, or if you know what flower color it typically produces, if you can narrow down what area of the state you're in, whether or not that plant has thorns. All of these things help to narrow down that 400 something plants to one that's a little bit more digestible. And then if you can't find your specific plant, at least you could tell Marco, hey, it looks like such and such, but it varies by leaf shape or something, and he can probably pinpoint it for you. Each page of these plants has not only a description, but individual plant pictures, which is nice because it's individual plant parts up close, and also that plant growing in the field, because often when it's in the field, it looks very different than when we start looking at it up close on the individual plant parts. Another cool place to go is an app. So you can use this on your phone or on a tablet, and it's called Leaf Snap. This is only for trees, and it was developed in the Northeast. So I have to say that a lot of the plants like honey mesquite or some of our mixed brush we have in deep South Texas is not on this app yet, but hopefully they'll add it. But it is a nice app that they're trying to improve and slowly adding more plant species that would be applicable for our area. What you do is you put a white piece of paper behind that tree leaf, you take a picture with your phone or your tablet, and it uses the shape of that leaf to narrow down what tree that could possibly be. And then when you click on the different tree types, because you'll probably recognize a few of the names, it has some really beautiful pictures and great information about these different trees, what their usefulness might be, things like that. Another thing I might send you to is Agweed ID, because I know you also have quite a bit of farmland around you. And a lot of times there's specific weeds that grow in certain crops, especially depending on what time of year it is. And so this is a free app, so you could use it and then delete it. That's available for both Apple and Android products. And what you do is you put in the month, location, what crop is being grown nearby, weed type, and it's going to narrow down what weeds that likely is. And what I really like about it that we're often lacking in range and pasture is pictures of these plants in their early, mid, and mature stages. Because, you know, if we're going to tell you to put out an herbicide on weeds, for example, for your annual weeds, you need to treat them when they're 6 inches tall or less. And a lot of times that's just not the time that people start to notice they're an issue. And so having these early detection systems where you can identify weeds earlier is really a really great thing that they've included. Agweed ID was actually, ID Weeds was actually developed up in Missouri, but it still has a lot of the same weeds that we're dealing with down here. It's also a free app that has about 400 plants on it. And what I like about this one is that it's from all walks of life. So crops, pastures, lawns, aquatic situations, they're all included in this one app. And it has really nice pictures to help you narrow down what plant that might be by the different leaf arrangements, the leaf shape, or the outside edge of the leaf, what those things look like, to help you identify your plants a little bit more quickly. East Texas Wildflowers and also West Texas Wildflowers are both really cool apps that have over 2,000 weeds in them that people might consider pretty for a short period of time in the year. This is a really neat app that also has a lot of features to help you narrow down what plant you have. And again, absolutely free. And it's probably the websites that carry the most amount of plants that I've been able to find thus far. The only toxic plant app that I've been able to find is one out of the Dakotas, but it's still somewhat applicable for those that we deal with here. And this is an app that would tell you not only about different toxic plants, but also what factors or what attributes you might see in your livestock as a result of them consuming these plants. So finally, if you like a book, which I really prefer, I have a lot of really nice plants ID books, but some of my favorites include this South Texas Brush Book, which I guarantee you is the best. It started out as a Texas Parks and Wildlife publication. It's called Common Woody Plants and Cacti of South Texas, and you can order it right off Amazon for about 16 or 17 bucks. And that one not only tells you a good description about the plant, it's divided by thorned and unthorned plants, and it'll tell you the crude protein value for deer. It'll also talk about different uses, historical uses of the plant, which is extremely interesting. And then when we talk about other plant ID books, I made a little list right here. You can take a picture of that, or I can send you a PDF of this presentation later. But the Range Plants of North Central Texas book, it's a big floppy book. It's really an excellent resource. It was created by Ricky Lennox, or the effort was led by Ricky Lennox. This is often available at your Soil and Water Conservation District offices, and they sell them for varying prices, but I've heard from $20 to $25. So that's definitely something you might look into. Another one is Brush and Weeds of Texas Rangelands that was produced by Dr. Hart when he was still with the Extension Service. This is still a really great general book. If you're first getting into different plant ID, it might be a good one to start with, and has some really nice plants kind of based off of our website, that Texas Range database. The Field Guide to Common Texas Grasses is my favorite grasses book because they've actually scanned in images of actual plants instead of having a sketch or a really terrible field picture. So they really did a nice book for grasses right there, and it's only 20 bucks. And then Toxic Plants of Texas is the resource for toxic plants in our state. It has signs that you will see in livestock, possible control options for those plants, and has a very comprehensive list of toxic plants that you might deal with livestock. All right, so number 4, you've identified your plants. Let's talk about problem plants. Here's a few that we want to go over very quickly. Let me see how I'm doing good on time. So these are a few plants that you probably have run into, and I can definitely, especially at the end if you want to, after I finish all of this, we can answer just personal questions about problems that you might be having specifically on your place. The first one I'm going to cover is mesquite, because goodness, we have a lot of mesquite, and it's also about time to start taking care of it if you're going to use an herbicide application for this plant. Mesquite, we're still spraying with 1% Sendero for individual plant treatment applications, and broadcast we're using 28 ounces of Sendero per acre. And we're going to talk about the application method of these later, and I'll also shoot you over to a resource for our brush busters, which is right here. Brush Busters is a program that was designed a long time ago to talk about exactly how to treat individual plants, and it'll tell you the stem and the leaf spray method, exactly what to mix up in your container. And then furthermore, we have one on cut stump treatment, which will cover all of those today, but just know that those resources are available for you. When we spray mesquite, we do not want them to be flowering or elongating a bean or growing new leaf, like you see in this picture, that very limey green color right there. We want to avoid that and wait until the plant is not doing any of those things and is in a nice dark green leaf stage, because we know that that plant is then mature and storing its carbohydrates or its sugars in the root. Why do we need them to store it in the root? Well, the idea behind any leaf spray of herbicide is that when that plant is conducting photosynthesis on its leaf, the sunlight hits the leaf, it creates those sugars or carbohydrates, and it wants to store them in the root. But if it's beaning or flowering or growing new leaf, it's not going to do it at that time. And the idea is to connect our chemical with that carbohydrate or that sugar, so it takes it down to the bud zone of that plant and kills it for good. So you're not treating the same plant again next year. So we're not talking about suppressing plants. We're trying to kill these plants. So application at the right time for a leaf spray is very, very important. Typically, since y'all already have the right soil temperature down in your area, we're just waiting until all the leaves are a dark green color, which is affected by these rainfalls that we seem to be getting, which we're very thankful for. If you've been lucky enough to get rainfall, you might see some new growth on the end of that stem. You'll just wait until those leaves are mostly a dark green color, and that's when you'll want to spray. So I would do it sooner than later, so we don't have drought conditions and problems with insects later this summer. But typically my ideal spray time is usually the first week in June. With these rainfalls, I'm going to wait and see what the leaf condition is before I decide to spray, but it's definitely getting close, so we're right there. Weesatch, does anybody have trouble with weesatch? Jose's saying yes, so I'm going to go ahead and go over weesatch. This tree is a problem because it does really well, especially in areas that hold water on clayier lands. You'll find weesatch really invading the area, and it's a tough one to kill, but I'm going to be going over a new chemical later that's very, very impressive on weesatch from a broadcast standpoint, especially that we're very excited to have labeled just this year, that might be kind of a saving grace for this plant. But definitely weesatch is a difficult one. The way you tell it apart from mesquite is that weesatch has paired thorns. Instead of one single long pin-like thorn, you'll see paired thorns. Also, the leaves are twice compounded. So mesquite has a leaflet. Like if you pull off a leaf, you can actually wiggle all the leaflets on that leaf. Weesatch divide again. So those leaflets will actually divide. And so you have tiny, tiny leaves, but a lot of them. And that's what makes this plant really difficult to control, because it's hard to get good coverage once the plant gets to any size. All right, so weesatch is often called sweet acacia because it does smell pretty good when it's blooming, but that's probably the only redeeming factor I found for weesatch. It's a legume, but it probably doesn't do, they haven't found that it does as much nitrogen fixation in the soil as a mesquite would. So not a lot of benefit to having weesatch, quite honestly. And the problem is that when we get rainfall, this tree can grow 3 or 4 feet in a year. So if it's something that you put off on your management and your goals, you know, it's not one of your objectives for that year, it could very well be a huge problem the following year. pretty poor grazing for wildlife and livestock. They say it could provide some protection, but in South Texas, we have enough plants with thorns on them for protection of wildlife that I don't feel like we need to harbor weesatch for that reason. We're spraying weesatch individual plant treatments with either Grazon P+D if you have a pesticide applicator's license, or Sendero at 1%, either one. If you do not have a pesticide applicator's license, they both work just as well. The reason I lean towards Grazon P+D is because it costs about $1 less per gallon of mix than the Sendero. That's the only reason. We typically spray weesatch in the fall, like October time frame. But if your weesatch is looking good and leafy and healthy when you're spraying individual plant treatments of mesquite with Sendero, you could go ahead and hit them with an individual plant treatment during a mesquite timing. But again, the best time to spray them is when we have soil moisture, and typically in the fall. All right, what we know about weesatch is that there's been trials done on the same place 3 years in a row. And the only difference was the soil moisture. So in 2000, they didn't have any rainfall and they got really, really poor kill. Whereas the other years they were getting like 90% kill of weesatch. So then through further broadcast trials that we've conducted both by ground and air, we have confirmed that weesatch is highly tied to soil moisture. So if you've gotten at least, 2 to 3 inches 2 weeks before you spray, or 4 inches 4 weeks before you spray, you're more likely to get control of that tree when you do your application, leaf application. You can still, by the way, do a stem spray or cut stump treatment on weesatch any time of year, and that is very effective, especially if you have 3 or less stems on the stem spray, and if you get a good, clean, flat cut on the cut stump. And we'll talk about that more. This plant, does anyone have trouble with sandbur? Is this worth going over? Marco's shaking his head yes, so we're going to go ahead and go over.
We do in the sandy country.
You do in the sand. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over sandbur just because it's often of interest to people. Kind of a nasty plant once it gets established, and the problem is that oftentimes it establishes where soils are poor or it's lacking some nutrients, and that's probably why it does so well in sandy country. My mom has a place with deep, deep sand, and I don't think we'll ever rid ourselves of sandbur, but there are some practices that you could consider to increase your chances of lessening its effects on everything. So cultural methods include doing a soil test and fertilizing appropriately. So we know that a lot of these soils are lacking things to make your other applications grow or your other grasses grow. Oftentimes we have trouble with them in Bermuda grass pastures, and we'll talk about a chemical option for that, but you want to make sure that you're maintaining 2 to 3 inches of stubble for even Bermuda grass and thatch over the winter, and that's just going to shade out areas where we know these seeds are going to drop and then be back the next year. It is an annual weed, so it comes back from seed every single year. So the plants that you see next year, you won't see, or the plants you see this year, you will not see next year, but very likely you will see their progeny if they're allowed to seed out. We have a pre-emergent control option on pastures, and Bermuda grass and other warm season perennial grasses, and that's Prowl H2O. You'll apply it in the dormant season or in between cuttings. You don't want to apply it between green up and your first cutting. So if you applied too late, you already are cutting, go ahead and wait until you finish your cutting and then go ahead and apply it. So you'll put out 1.1 to 4.2 quarts per acre. The problem is that you need a rainfall. We have been catching some random storms lately, but very hard to determine that you're for sure going to get a rainfall. It's kind of like fertilizer in that way, but it's needed to activate this chemical. So it's possible to put it out and then not get any effect from it due to droughty conditions. The other option is to glyphosate individual areas. You apply it before green up or immediately after cutting before regrowth of your Bermuda grass. You're going to expect some injury and yield loss if you apply it after green up. So again, timing on these things is very, very important. Roundup Weather Max is 4.5 pounds of active ingredient, and you're going to put out 8 to 11 fluid ounces per acre. But please note, it's no problem if you choose to use a generic glyphosate, even though Roundup Weather Max includes a very aggressive surfactant and other benefits for you. But if you put out a generic, you need to look at the poundage of active ingredient, because oftentimes it's less than the pound of active ingredient in Roundup. And in that case, you're going to need to put out a higher rate than you're traditionally used to using. So I've had people tell me, I put out Roundup like you recommended, and it did not do anything to my sambar. And it's because they were using a generic and assuming that they were comparable. They are comparable as far as having the same active ingredient, but may not be the same amount. So don't look at percent, look at active ingredient. Poundage of active ingredient. Your other option that some of you probably heard of is Pastora. It's a Bayer product, a granular product that you can put out, but the sambar needs to be just 1 inch to 1.5 inches tall. So timing is very, very important for Pastora. And the idea is that it's going to hit them at the right time, suppress that grass burr, and allow your Bermuda grass to outcompete it. Be sure to apply that when they're no bigger than 1.5 inches tall and your Bermuda grass is less than 4 inches tall. So another option for you, some people really love it, other people don't, and I think that has to do specifically with timing, but Pastora would be our safer post-emergent application recommendation. So our goal is to control these seeds. Pastora has to be applied when they're only 1.5 inches tall or less. If you apply them when your plant is bigger, it might slow it down and keep it from growing to seed. That's the best it would do, and I can assure you Pastora is not cheap. So that's a pretty expensive application just to suppress your plant. But if you've already got seeds, there's nothing you can do about that. I had one agent say, you might as well drag a burlap sack behind a four-wheeler and collect your seed, because at that point, the do has already been done. But within each of those capsules is your little seed that's going to germinate and come back next year. All right, King Ranch Blue Stem is our next plant I was going to go over. King Ranch Blue Stem, or if you're along the coast, you might have Clayburgh Blue Stem. Either one, kind of the same problems, the same management applications. It's a very tough grass to kill once you get it into your pastures. It tends to outcompete everything, including buffalo grass, pretty easily. Very hardy grass that was planted along the roadsides and by Soil Conservation Service back in the day in areas that were prone to erosion. So the idea was to use this grass to hold the soils, and boy, does it hold the soils. So it does do its job. It's just quite invasive, and it's not necessarily a grass that is beneficial from a wildlife standpoint because it becomes a monoculture of that one grass. And also from a livestock standpoint, it's fairly poor quality because its green period is very short early in the spring, and quite quickly it becomes stemmy, which cattle tend to avoid it, overgraze your better grasses, and then you've got a problem because you're kind of killing off your better grasses to where King Ranch Blue Stem then further takes the place of them. So it's kind of a vicious cycle once it gets into your pastures. Chemical control can be done with glyphosate, but Roundup, but again, that's not a selective herbicide, so it's going to kill anything that's green at the time. And then you can use Pastora that we just talked about, but it's a suppression, and you have to apply it twice at 1 ounce each time. You're going to apply it once and then apply it again 4 to 8 weeks later, so say 6 weeks later. I have never in my research projects had success in South Texas with Pastora. It's either too dry the second time you spray, or the King Ranch Blue Stem is not suppressed long enough for anything else to grow and have any productive time with enough soil moisture to make it and do any good from the suppression. So I don't typically suggest using Pastora as a suppression technique. And again, that would only be a suppression technique on Bermuda grass pastures. That's all it's labeled for. We're currently experimenting with some pre-emergence, which is exciting, or some things that have some soil activity, so that might have some lengthy period of time that it would suppress these seeds from coming back. We're also looking at some other applications, which I think I cover in just a second. Combination treatments where we've thrown lots of different applications, mechanical, chemical, fire at this plant, have not been successful. Most of these combination treatments returned to pre-treatment levels within 3 to 6 months, but all came back within 2 years. Plowing combinations obviously lasted the longest, but if you plow up, be prepared to replant something. And our thinking right now is that you will not want to replant something of any price. You probably want to do like an annual plant that you could sort of keep planting annually until you farm out that King Ranch Blue Stem seed from the pasture, and then go back and establish something like your natives that Jose is going to talk about a little bit later. We're looking at germination rates of King Ranch Blue Stem because it's very important that we know how long that seed that's in the soil is viable for germination. So how long will you be fighting those plants coming back in your soil before you can feel confident about reseeding? And prevention, that's our biggest key to this. If you do not have King Ranch Blue Stem in your pastures right now, you will. And so you need to be vigilant about keeping it out. And some of the ways to do this is definitely to learn how to identify King Ranch Blue Stem. It is not your friend. You want to take it out as soon as you can with glyphosate. You want to monitor your roads or where you're feeding hay, because that's going to be an easy place for it to come in and just start taking hold. Spot spray any new recruits, again with that glyphosate, probably a 2% rate of glyphosate. Make sure that if any people that are bringing equipment on, or say you have hunters that come in with their vehicles, limit where they're allowed to go with their vehicles. And you can request equipment to be weed washed, where they would wash the equipment down to make sure they're not bringing King Ranch Blue Stem seed off of somebody else's property to plant onto your property. You may also want to think about maintaining buffers next to King Ranch fields. If you have King Ranch surrounding you or in the ditches, you might leave undisturbed vegetation along that section so that that area does not easily let King Ranch Blue Stem encroach in any bare ground. And also you might maintain something similar to a fire guard, especially if you're already doing that for prescribed burning purposes. Be sure that you regularly glyphosate your fire guard so that King Ranch Blue Stem doesn't end up in your pastures. And that reminds me, fire will definitely spread this plant. I've been privy to areas where it was suggested they burn, and they did burn, and it came back, instead of a nice buffalo grass field with the occasional King Ranch Blue Stem plant, it became a solid King Ranch Blue Stem plant. So if it's a minor component in your plant population, you do not want to do any disturbance that would open up bare ground, because that is where King Ranch Blue Stem is going to take hold. So definitely fire is one of those things that it's well adapted to, and it will take over the pasture in a big way. So number 5, assess your situation. So where are you right now? We know that thick brush can be fairly inaccessible. It can also shade out the ground so that forage typically doesn't grow there. Not much forage there, and it's kind of impenetrable to livestock. And so there's a kind of a double whammy for why we might want to thin out really thick brush areas. There was a project done where they put GPS collars on cattle, and they followed where they went. And they labeled the amount of brush in the pasture on a scale of 1 to 5. So 0 had no brush in the pasture, 1 had a little bit encroaching, 2 over here a little more, 3 a little more. 4 is getting pretty dense, and 5 is pretty much what I would call impenetrable or not very fun to crawl through. So what brush density would you give this area? You can either say it, unmute yourself and say it, or type it in the chat box.
$2.5.
Yeah, I give it about a 2.
A 2? 2.5. It's actually 2.15. No, this is, I would probably say this is a 2. If you included a little bit more in the back area, I'd probably give it a 3. But you're probably looking at about a 2 already right here. And so this is the time when we really want to start about thinking about individually plant treating some of these plants just to keep a balanced amount of plants in the area so it does not become what we see in the background of that picture. What happened when they put those GPS collars on the cattle is they found that they had an 81% or a 73% use for a 1 or a 2. When you got to a 3, it dropped dramatically to only 25% use by livestock, and a 4 or a 5 was not used. So let's look at what that means. A 3 right here only had 25% use by livestock. A 4 or a 5 had no use. So what's funny is we've had people say that we used wussy cows in this study, which maybe they're wussy cows, but you can be assured that if your cattle are in really thick brush like this, where there's a plant over here and a plant over here, it's not efficient for them to be grazing in an area like that. And so they're going to actually use more energy than they're taking in, which is not healthy for any amount of time for livestock. So know that when things start to get to about a 3, you really need to start considering what you're going to do to set back succession, because it's kind of gone in the direction of brush to a level that would not be advantageous if you're managing for livestock. So some ways to get an overhead picture, a bird's eye view of your land. There's a lot of different ways now with all the technology coming out, but a couple of good resources, and this one's absolutely free, that I like to send people to is an app that you can download on your tablet or your smartphone, and it's good for both Android and Apple products. You can buy a more advanced version of GIS Explorer, but the basic version kind of does everything you want it to do. I'm going to show you today. When you open that app up, you're going to go to the bottom where it says continue without signing in, very, very small in light. Click on that. You'll choose your map you want, and I would suggest searching for something that has the background shown up so you can see your plants and like pavement and where water is. This helps to decipher between those things on your land. So you're looking for something with imagery. I would look for imagery in the name. When you pull up the map, you can push this little arrow button up here, and that's going to take you to your location. So here I was outside of San Antonio near Bass Pro Shops, and it kind of zoomed to my location. I took a screenshot, and again, you can change the background on these maps, and I changed it up there to imagery, but for the example, I left it as is, where you can see the roads, because it was hard to see my drawings and everything with the imagery. So you can do measurements, both straight lines, or you can do area, where you would just click around an area and it would tell you how many acres that is. You can change the units down to acres. So we know this little area is 6.72 acres. How would I use this? Well, the straight lines obviously would help you if you're determining how long a pipeline would be or a fence line that you need to replace. But the acreage, you can start to see with your imagery the very thick brush areas or areas that are getting very weedy. You could calculate how many acres those are and determine how many acres you could justify spending the money on for that year to try to get under control. So it's a good way to join up using technology when you're setting your objectives for the year to determine where your management dollars might go. Another app that I really like, especially if you are in an area where land is getting subdivided quickly, or you work on other people's places, it could be very helpful if you have another side job. This OnX Hunt app is obviously a hunting app, but it is available for Apple or Android, and for the entire state of Texas license, it costs $30 a year. So that does seem a little steep because we're used to having a lot of free apps available to us, but what this does is takes the tax assessor's office information on land holdings and puts it into the app. So you can get a free trial. So I would suggest you download this, try it out, and then if you don't want to pay for the $30 for the year, just delete it. But these red lines are actually boundaries of people's property. It tells you who owns that property, and when you click on it, it gives you their address and how many acres they own right there. In addition, you're getting a satellite map of their properties, so you can kind of see what practices are going on. This looks like they've done some terracing or something on this property to try to capture the water. Very interesting. Maybe they're farming this area. Very interesting to get an aerial view of what neighboring properties look like. And not only that, but see how many acres they actually hold and who owns it. It is a hunting app, so you can follow your tracks. Very valuable for me because I often get lost in the brush, but this will help you get back out to your truck, or you can mark different features, or if you see something neat you need to come back to, or something that needs treated later, you can make a mark on your map and it'll save that. Soil Web is a really nice app too, and it uses the GPS in your phone or tablet to tell you what soils you're standing on. And of course, this is fairly rough, but NRCS has worked really hard over the past decade or two to try to refine these maps. They use a lot of LiDAR imaging and following up on old paper soil survey maps that were completed. And this will tell you kind of how the soils change as you move down into the profile of your soil. It'll also tell you what plants typically would grow well in your soil, which will be helpful for Jose's presentation later on native reseeding. This is a really good resource. It's probably going to overload you with information on soil, but it's cool to have this on your phone and at your fingertip. So if you're curious why you tend to have more weeds or brush invasion in a certain area, this may lead you to understand why the soils are different and how they vary and the limitations that might accompany those soil types. So another place I would send you, because I actually prefer it to that Soil Web app, is to go on your desktop to Web Soil Survey, and you can just pull up Google and type in Web Soil Survey and this website will pop up. This is a really neat web soil app that's on your desktop that's available for anybody for free, that's put out by USDA and NRCS. And what you'll do is start right here by clicking this green button, but if you forget everything I say, there's 4 basic steps right here on the front page to walk you through making a soil map of your land. So when you click on the green button, this will come up. Again, it's USDA, so it's for the entire nation. But over here, you can search by either address or state and county. Here I've put in Binbolt, Texas, and it kind of zoomed into Binbolt. I did Binbolt because we have a research and demonstration ranch just outside of Binbolt, La Capita, that I used for this example. So I just used these zoom in, zoom out buttons to move down the roads to get me to La Capita because I didn't have a physical address for the place. I found this area and I clicked around it. I knew this was La Capita because they did the old cell grazing system as research back in the day. I use these area of interest to set it. And you can either do a plain square or a rectangle, or you can set your own shape. And I just click, 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 double click. And you know you set your area of interest after you double click and it puts blue lines through that area. So this could be one of your pastures, or you could do your entire place at once. All right, after we do area of interest, we're gonna go to the next tab called soil map. And on soil map, it gives you a list of the different soils in your place, the area and the number of acres that comprises that soil, and the percent of your entire area that's that. And what's cool is some of these are actually just separated by slope, like the Czar-Fine Sandy right here. But you can kind of see what your dominant soils are for your place and look up more information about those specific soils. Or if this is all you want, just to know what soils you have, you can always add it to your shopping cart, which is a little misleading because it's free, but you add it to your cart and you can print off a very nice soils map right there. What I would encourage you to do is go to the 3rd tab called Soil Data Explorer. Under this tab, you can find out more information than you ever wanted to know about your soils on your place. You can do construction ability, vegetative productivity, wildlife management, water management, all kinds of information where it tells you the suitabilities and limitations associated with that soil type. Here I look at vegetative productivity, and for range production, which is kind of my thing, it has 3 different options: favorable, normal, and unfavorable year. When you click on normal year, it gives you the options of viewing the description or the rating. So under the description, it's going to tell you, hey, we're telling you what these soils could historically have carried as far as what vegetation they support and how many pounds per acre they typically did. But if you've done any management that have changed those that vegetative cover or degraded the soil type in any way, then that could change the estimation, of course. But when you view the rating, it's going to give you an estimate on the pounds per acre that those soil types could carry. So why is this important when you're deciding whether or not to treat brush and weed issues? Well, if I only have a limited amount of dollars to spend that year, and if you don't, then I am available for adoption. But if you have a limited number of dollars to put out for that year, then it would make sense to me that you would find what soils are most productive and kind of go after those first, because you know you can get a bigger bang for your buck by removing brush on land that is going to grow you more grass, for instance. So those are kind of ways that you can use your goal and your objectives for the year, and then these tools to help narrow down exactly where you want to put those dollars. If you go over to ecological site assessment, that's a pretty neat tab. What it's doing is kind of taking all of your fine soil types and it's gathering them in bigger groups that defines more of your soil type based on climate and different ways that those plant communities on that land kind of transfer over time. So they all kind of act in the same way. And it'll actually show you pictures about if you let your land go, kind of over time as succession happens, how that land tends to develop. So we're going to look at an example here in a minute, but when we apply one of our rangeland tools, we're just setting back succession to an earlier stage. So those are kind of neat to look at. This will also tell you by ecological site what plants you might want to consider replanting that tend to do well on those types of soils. All right, so after you get a broad look at your resources, what you've got, your layout of the land, how much you might be able to treat for the year, let's think about your options. So in your range management toolbox, you really have four main tools: fire, prescribed fire; chemical applications, putting the herbicide on unwanted plants; mechanical applications; and biological control, which would be like using your cattle to improve your land for wildlife. So maybe create bare ground with your cattle to where you grow more forbs for wildlife, or bringing in, say, goats to suppress your brush. They won't control your brush, but they could suppress your brush for a period of time. That's a biological control option. So based on your goal, how do you know how or when to apply a management tool? I get this question all the time. Like, I've been to your classes, Megan, like, great, I learned how to do these things, but how do I know how to actually apply that on my landscape? And really, it's a fairly predictable response by plants. This is plant succession that we talked about. So depending on your goal, you find out where on that continuum of plant succession, as they tend to go from annual weeds to grasses to perennials that are going to be there every year, to brush to bigger trees. Where on that continuum do you need to be to have the most productive land to meet your goals? So here's an example of plant succession, which is just a fancy way to say how the plant communities are replacing each other as you progress. So various serial stages are also called successional stages. So you might hear somebody talk about serial stage. They're just talking about what bunch of plant community replaced something else. So in your area, was it a vast grassland? Not really. So you already had clumps of brush. That's definitely documented in earlier papers. But largely, you had a lot of open grassland, a lot more than we had now. I mean, there's areas that describe Hebronville as open and fairly void of timber. So today, we just can't picture Hebronville fairly void of timber, but those were the conditions back when. That's because it was maintained regularly by wildfires. They were allowed to burn, not suppressed through the area. Grazing was not nearly as intense. So once we brought in sheep and really overgrazed the area and increased the brush in that area, we started to see that our successional stage was more like a 4 or a 5, whereas it used to be maintained a lot more closer to a 2 or a 3. So what we do with these range management tools is we push back succession, and how we apply those makes a big difference because you're going to get different results depending about when or how or what you choose to do. So here's another example: annual plants turning into perennial grasses, shrubs. Okay, we don't have a pine forest, but this is sort of the general direction that it would go. So typically things want to move towards a brushier environment now. And what we're trying to do is open up space for that sunlight to generate more of our grasses and forb seeds that are there in the topsoil, hopefully, and to grow those up so that we have more production for livestock. So we're going to talk about some of these tools in a lot of detail, but what I want to point out first is that all management practices are not necessarily good. I probably do 70% of my research on herbicides. And so when people ask me, how do I, and probably Marco too, when they say, how do I control such and such? You immediately think what herbicide will kill that plant. But sometimes there's other alternatives, or for your situation, one of our other tools might make more sense, or even a combination of the tools may make a lot more sense. So I would warn you against having a hammer and thinking of everything as a nail. We have to think very well-roundedly about how we apply these tools according to our goals and our objectives for that year. So the first thing I want to talk about is prescribed fire. Great tool. Why would you burn? I get asked this a lot. Why burn? Well, besides, it used to be something that maintained these lands in a lot more grassy states, and that's something that a lot of people are trying to get back to, at least partially. It can increase the quality and the quantity of your forage, at least for a limited amount of time. It can do some brush management as far as suppressing brush or pruning up larger trees as nice shade trees. It will not be a control method for your brush, because all the brush species you're dealing with are resprouting species. But they can set them back a little bit to gain you some headway, and in used in combination with some of the herbicide treatments that we're going to talk about can be quite effective for transforming your land into what you want it to look like. It can do residue rank control, provide good wildlife habitat. In fact, some people talk about how they don't have consistent forage, so they get an ugly burn. And I consider ugly burns really beneficial from a wildlife standpoint, because you get some good burning over here and something different over here. And all of this works together to provide a lot of things that our wildlife species are looking for on the landscape. Can do parasite control. That could be very important as we head more and more into issues with things like fever ticks. This can actually cut the life cycle of those insects so that they are not as abundant later on. In fact, there's evidence that Indians used fire even to smoke out mosquitoes. Have you ever wondered, when mosquitoes are really bad, how people back in the day even tolerated this? I know that I have thought very highly of these people who were able to survive in this environment, but they had some tricks and some management as well that helped for them to cope with the way the environment was. And then, of course, innovative grazing. We know that livestock will naturally go to areas where there's new green growth because it's highly nutritious and easy to digest. They just prefer that. And so if you patched burned on a place consistently enough, you could actually move your livestock around using that as a pattern. So of course, there's lots of pros. Out in the hill country where they have blueberry juniper, a fire could kill the tree. And so they use that quite a bit to transform that land, because you're able to control that non-resprouting species so easily. But you know, it can do a little bit for our brush, but not tons. But again, good tool in combination with the other tools we have available to try to grow more fuel to have better fires in the future. Cons, like we already discussed, dang, will it spread King Ranch blue stem. So if you have invasive grass species, and there's a few in your area, guinea grass, these species are very tolerant to fire, and they will come right back. So that might not be a good control method if that's your objective for that. They don't have much effect on larger resprouting trees or shrubs, and they're not selective within a plant community. So of course, if you're applying a chemical or a mechanical application, you can tend to be a little bit more selective than if you're lighting a fire, because you just can't have too much control unless you're going to put in a lot of black lines or a lot of disc fire lines. So when we talk about resprouting brush species, I always like to mention that this is what we're talking about. If the soil surface was at the top of this picture, All these little wart-like looking structures, those are buds. This is the bud zone. And on a mesquite tree, it's going to go down to where the first lateral roots come out. So usually about 18 inches on an older tree. But even if that plant has been top killed or top removed in some way, and it comes back from several buds, so a single stem mesquite tree might become a multi-stem tree if it has been top killed in the past or top removed in the past. All of those stems then join up in an area I call the saddle underneath the soil surface, and they're connected to the same original bud zone of that tree. So you're talking about maybe a small tree on top, but if it's multi-stemmed, that root system is the size of the original tree, which is crazy. We're talking about trying to control something that has a very huge root mass underneath the ground. But we're not trying to kill all of the roots. When we do mechanical treatment and grub out trees, we're only trying to get out this bud zone right here. So I've driven up to properties where they've ripped out roots all over the pasture, and it looks like a bomb went off because they didn't understand that their target was really just that 18 inches below the soil surface or so to get that bud zone out so it doesn't resprout. Chemical management options are varied. So you have a lot of different options, which makes it a pro. The flexibility, where you could do leaf, a stem, or a cut stump treatment. You can spray individual plants, or you can broadcast herbicide on plants. They're fairly economical, so especially if you follow up any broadcast applications the following year and the year after that with individual plant treatments to prolong the life of your investment, they can be fairly economical. They're great as a retreatment or a follow-up, and they can be used in combination with fire, like we already discussed, with grazing or with mechanical treatment options where needed. The cons are that some chemicals just require a license, like we talked about Graze on P+D earlier. That requires a pesticide applicator's license, which Marco can help you to get if that's something that you need for your place. Leaf sprays also need to be very timely, which we also kind of already covered. And of course, there's an aversion to the use of chemicals, which there's probably good reason for that. I actually came from the wildlife world. In wildlife, you don't talk a whole lot about chemical application, even though it's becoming more commonplace as we get better and better herbicide tools. But the aversion is to people not using them correctly. So you have to follow the label. The label's the law. You have to apply them as directed, and it's always good to base your applications on good data. And so that's what the Extension Service, that's what I work at very hard, providing data for people to utilize so that you don't have to do trial and error. We'll do trial and error for you so that when you make that investment, it's on something that we know has a good shot at working. Mechanical control. Lots of pros there too. You can remove roots like grubbing. Some people root plow, even though we only suggest that in very limited instances, because most of the time you're going to have to follow a root plow with a reseeding, because you're probably turning over that free seed in your topsoil when you do that. Some instances you can get away with that in shallower soils, but most of the time you're going to have to follow that up. You can remove stems or flowers by shredding or disking. Sometimes people disc late winter to encourage forb growth as a free wildlife food plot. So there's really some really cool management applications that can be made with mechanical control. You can temporarily suppress most plants with mechanical options. And of course, they can be used in combination with some of our other tools. A big con of mechanical control is that it disturbs the soil. That's what I'm most concerned about. When we lose an inch of topsoil, it takes hundreds of years. We won't see it in our lifetime be remade. And so maintaining our healthy soils is a huge push right now, which I think is wonderful that we've taken our focus onto the soils, because that's the basis of everything we could ever grow on our place. It can also be very expensive. And sometimes when people own their own equipment, they don't think about the expense, but the maintenance of that equipment, the fuel, and the time that you spend on that all contribute towards the cost of doing a management application. Plants can also adapt to frequent mowing. So we see it even with, like, let's say King Ranch bluestem. It'll actually start to grow prostrate along the ground, and it'll seed out at a shorter height. So sometimes when you're driving down the highway, places that mow the side of the highway frequently might actually have King Ranch Blue Stem that's shorter, and you might think it's a different plant, but it's just adapted to that management that's been applied to it. And then I say shredding is therapy, which I really should change the way I put that in my presentation. But what I mean by that is if you're shredding brush, for instance, to control your brush, and you're probably having to do that every single year, if not twice a year, to maintain that pretty look, you're creating a bigger problem because you're just increasing the number of stems on that plant. The root system is still hardy and going. And if you do that to make it pretty because it looks nice, which I totally agree with you, instead of going to see a counselor for your problems, by all means, I think you should keep up shredding. But if you're shredding in order to control your plant species, we have some much better control options for you that would be a long-term investment than shredding would do. So weigh out whether or not that shredding practice is working for you, or if there's some way you could maybe let your trees grow to 3 feet tall and then apply chemical or do a mechanical grubbing application, something that might help you get to a control measure instead of doing the suppression year after year after year. You might find that you're actually spending less time on it. It's more productive for the forage that's able to grow year after year in that place. And it might actually be cheaper long run for you to do that. So there's also some biological management options. Of course, we talked about what biological control was, but if you probably already have livestock, but if people are thinking about bringing livestock in that don't have them, but they want to use them just for management, which might be you moving your livestock onto somebody's leased property for a short period of time. Remember that you need a lot of different things at that site rather than just grass. So yes, people might like you to bring your livestock in and kind of flash graze an area for them if they're mainly managing for wildlife, but make sure that they've got the water. Oh, I think he just got unmuted. Here, I think I can mute him.
Vidal. I think you muted Vidal.
Oh, he got it. Okay, no problem at all. No problem. Okay, so think about also how far that leased place would be from taking them to the market or from your other location, because you're gonna have to regularly check on them. So some different options that might actually be beneficial for you, but also some things that you really want to heavily consider before you get into moving livestock onto different places for management tools. Lots of pros. This is the only practice we have that will gain you money. Every other management tool we have is money going out. Using livestock for management tools, the only way you could actually benefit from that. And also, of course, you can use them in combination with patch burning or shredding, as long as they're palatable species that you're shredding. So that kind of goes over to our cons. A lot of times the plants that we're having issues with, we're having issues because they're not great for grazing. Sometimes biological control just doesn't make sense for them. And then we have to think about the effect on non-target plants. So if you bring them in to say, control Johnson grass, cattle love Johnson grass. So when people call me and say, I'm having a huge problem with Johnson grass, my first question is, do you not own cattle? And usually the answer is no, because cows will eat Johnson grass very readily. But once they're done with that, they're also going to eat other things on that place that you may not want to be heavily used. So being sure that you're grazing at the right rate, the right intensity is very important too. So within this picture, the inside area where you see that grazing exclosure, the fencing that's put up, cows were not allowed to graze in there. And you see there's a lot of weeds around the outside. That's common broomweed. So what we see from this is that those weeds were generated as a result of grazing, basically. And so sometimes it takes us stepping back and seeing what we're doing in our operation that might be causing us more trouble, and how we might be able to adjust something else in our operation to help the invasive or noxious plant side. So a lot of times when we have too many cattle, we're actually putting money out for weed control or brush control that might actually be cheaper if we just lowered our number of cattle. Plus, we've lowered our risk. We've lowered the amount of investment in those cows. So there's a lot of different things that you can look at to try to treat your weed and brush problem. They may not directly be one of those four targets in our range management toolbox. So when we allocate forage, be sure that you're leaving 50% of the forage. And what does that exactly mean? That means that you want 50% of the leaf height of that plant to still be there when they move to another pasture. This is very, very difficult for people. I know my grandpa is probably rolling over in his grave because I don't know that he ever left 50% of grass in his very sandy country before he moved to another pasture, because he would not have been able to run near as many cattle. But if we think long term about the plant health and the good grazing plants that we'll be able to leave on that property, and the lower amount of herbicide or mechanical treatments that we're doing on that property, it really could be much more beneficial for us to start utilizing our plants in a better way. So we know if I go to your place, if you're managing really well and your neighbor is not, we all know these scenarios, right? If I dig up a plant that has not been overgrazed on your place, you're going to have roots about as deep as the plant is tall. But if you keep overgrazing it, that grass is not allowed to put its effort into growing root, because it's having to put its effort into regrowing leaf constantly just to maintain itself. And so over time, your roots will actually shrink. So when we go dry, your good grazing grasses that the cows have nailed over and over and over again are the first things to leave your plant community. The other thing is, when we do have soil moisture, like maybe we get some rain right now, that soil moisture is deep in the soil profile. And if your roots aren't reaching that soil moisture, then it's doing you no good anyway. So long term, having plants that are healthy with deeper roots are going to be so much better for maintaining a healthy plant community with a diversity of plants, and with plants that are more nutritious, like we looked at earlier. Better crude protein, better digestibility, more sought after, kind of those ice cream grasses that the cattle really want. So they're not going to eat your trash grass first. That's what's going to be allowed to stay and be allowed to seed out and get back into the soil and grow. So taking care of your better plants is got to be your number one priority for long-term operation, profitability, and health of your land. So we know that if you have good soil coverage, it's very unlikely that you're going to have very many weeds, because they're just not going to get the sunlight they need on those seeds to germinate. As we start to see more bare ground, we always see more weeds start to encroach. And once you get even more bare ground, you see more weeds. So it's kind of classic. We know exactly what's going to happen. Plants work in predictable ways. And so you can start to manage to decrease the amount of weed or brush issues you have on your place. So number 7 is weed management with herbicides. I'm going to cover very quickly weed management. We're talking a lot about brush control, but weeds can also be a big deal. Annual weed, and that's funny because I say annual weeds, no big deal. Annual weeds are easier to kill, and that's because they have limited root systems. Annual weeds come back from seed every single year. So you're not going to see that same plant again. They, as a result, produce a lot of seeds. That's their life history strategy, is to produce lots of seeds, add lots of seed to the soil, and those seeds can be maintained in your soil for decades. So a lot of times people tell me, I have never seen this weed in my pasture before. You know, you either might be right if you've just taken over the land operation, or you may not remember it because it's literally been decades before that weed has been present. So what we want to do with annual weeds is control them very early in the year, and I mean 6 inches tall or so. So you're going to have to start scouting areas that you normally see these weed troubles in earlier in the spring and get on them right away to treat. Perennial weeds, on the other hand, you want to treat when they have maximum leaf and stem growth. And a lot of times you even want to spray them when they're flowering. It depends on the weed. So you got to read your label to make sure you're applying the herbicide at the right time. So sometimes people have a normal routine for weed spraying in pastures. They might always spray about, late March. Well, what they're probably doing is catering to their perennial weeds. They're taking care of their annual weed issue, but there's perennial weeds that they're going to find spread more and more each year. And that's because those are not getting applied with herbicide at the correct timing. So what I usually say is you got to pick what you're most mad at. You got to know what you're most mad at and target for that weed that year. Or if you need to, spray multiple times during the year. But you can't just do general weed spraying year after year or every 2 years. You need to start identifying what weeds you're having trouble with and really target the management for those. And then any others you get is kind of like a bonus. So a lot of annual broadleaf weeds we might find trouble with: bitter sneezeweed, prickly poppy, annual broomweed, woolly croton, marsh elder, your ground cells y'all have in your area. These are all annual weeds that come back from seed each year, and you need to treat when they're much earlier than the stages we're looking at in these pictures. So some people say, well, should I spray it or should I just shred it? If it's an annual, it's going to go away that year, right? You're not going to have trouble with it again unless it seeds out. And then if it did seed out, it's already kind of done its due in a way. So a project was done back in 2003 where they compared whether you should spray with a 30-foot boom or you should shred with a 6-foot rotary mower. And what they found, and you know, this is really debatable in my opinion, because they have the labor cost in here. And some people say, well, I do my own labor, so I'm not charging that. But let's think about your time too, because that means something. Or you could be using your time towards something else in your operation that's more beneficial or adding to your quality of life rather than mowing weeds. So what they found is that actually spraying in this scenario was a little bit cheaper. So you might need to put a pencil to paper and find out what you're paying and what you would estimate maintenance and operation of your equipment is, and decide if that's really benefiting you if you're considering just shredding. Not to mention, when you shred, you're also taking out your grass species. So any forage potential you had there, you're kind of limiting. So annual weed challenges. The minute they come up, they're sucking your land for moisture and nutrients, which is absolutely true. What we found is that if you treat weeds, you take out a pound of weeds, you'll gain about a pound of grass in return. If you have decent soils and you have vegetative cover to replace that. And on introduced grass fields, they've actually found that you'll get 2 or 3 pounds in return. If your improved or introduced grasses are healthy and productive. So what do you do if they don't all come up at the same time? That's a very typical scenario. First of all, definitely I'd say pick what you're most mad at. What you notice is becoming a bigger problem each year, but most of them will emerge at some point, and once they're all up, then you'll want to put out your treatment application. And just know that if some of those weeds have become taller than that 6-inch threshold, you may be looking at putting out a higher rate, because a lot of times on the label you'll see a rate range. You might be looking at putting out the higher of that rate range if you've let some of your weeds get a little bit too tall. So it's kind of a judgment as to when to pull the trigger, but most of the times your conditions are going to vary a little bit between your different species that are up. So here's some example of perennial broadleaf weeds. Perennials are the ones that, again, are going to be back next year. So I know, like on my mom's place, they sprayed pretty regularly in the coastal Bermuda grass pasture, but they were spraying at annual weed timing. And so she's having trouble with things like Yankee weed. It's spreading all over the place. And that's because that was the absolute wrong timing to be spraying for Yankee weed. But things like silverleaf nightshade, Texas bull nettle, false indigo, western ragweed, Carolina horse nettle, Texas thistle. Thistles you usually spray when they're in that rosette stage where they're laid out, splayed out on the ground. So again, make sure you identify the weeds that you're having trouble with, then we can get you a better recommendation as to when and what to spray, or if you have another alternative that might be easier. Okay, number 8, brush management with herbicide. We looked at this picture already. Think about that bud zone. That's our target. No matter what type of herbicide application we're applying to brush, we're still looking to treat that bud zone on the tree. When we do a leaf spray, the timing is very important, again, because we're trying to hook that chemical onto the carbohydrates being moved down to the root system to kill the plant. So very important. Usually I use a backpack sprayer. I use Solo brand backpack sprayers, but the brand is not necessarily as important as making sure that you're using the right nozzle type. And Solo, you can actually change out the spray wand to where a T-jet nozzle that we suggest will fit on there perfectly. If you buy one off the shelf, you might have to add like an O-ring behind the nozzle to get it to seal real well. But regardless, getting some sort of pump-up sprayer or backpack sprayer is helpful. Backpack sprayers are nice because you're not having to bend over as much. You're actually pumping standing straight up. I'm pretty tall, so I like to replace that wand with a little bit longer wand. And then that orange thing is actually an upgrade. It's just a halter that puts the weight on your hips instead of your shoulders. I get my backpacks and my harnesses from forestry suppliers, but there's several places that you could find those, including Tractor Supply. They don't carry Solo anymore, but they do have another brand. You could also put a rig on the back of a four-wheeler or a mule or the back of your truck that could carry more mixture at once. In fact, you could put some quick connects on something on the back of your truck and even have 3 wands going at the same time. So you could really think creatively about how you typically access your pastures and which setup would be making the most sense for you. For a leaf spray, we suggest a T-jet or cone jet X8. X8 is a bigger hole than we use for a stem or cut stump treatment, where we would recommend an X1 or an X2. That's because you need a big pattern spraying out to cover all of those leaves until they're wet, but not necessarily dripping. You got to get coverage of every stem, because if you forget one side, that tree is going to regrow from that side, and unfortunately you're going to have to treat that tree again in the future. So covering all the leaves is very important. You also want to put a mesh screen or a check valve behind that nozzle. That does a couple of things. One, it keeps the nozzle from clogging, and 2, when you let go of the handle, it'll keep it from dripping. So you're saving a little bit of your chemical mix and probably not getting it all over your boots. The mix for a foliar spray is a little more complicated than a stem or cut stump treatment, because we're trying to get that chemical into the leaf. And so you need a surfactant to cut that surface tension. So normally if you sprayed a leaf, it would look like the top here, like when it rains and those raindrops sit on the leaf. If you put a surfactant in, it cuts the surface tension so it can take that chemical into the leaf a little bit easier, like you see in that bottom leaf picture. So you're going to add in a little bit of water to your tank. You're going to put in your chemical, whatever chemical is suggested for that specific species you're spraying, and the amount that's right for that. So 1% Sendero, like we suggest for a mesquite spray, would be 1.28 ounces per gallon of mix. There's 128 ounces per gallon, so it's 1.28 ounces per mix. Then you would put in your surfactant, and you only need 0.25 of 1% of surfactant, but again, very important, even though it's only a little bit. So for a 1 gallon mix, you would need 0.32 ounces, 0.3, that's it. And then add in your blue dye. You're gonna need about 0.5 ounces of blue dye, so half an ounce of blue dye per gallon of mix. You do want to measure blue dye. Don't be like me. I caused this a lot of headache one day, because if it's blue, bluer is even better, right? So I was just dumping blue in until we could see it really well. But that blue dye will clog your nozzles, and it will make for a very frustrating application. So be sure you're measuring your blue dye. But the blue dye is very helpful. It's going to mark all of those leaves, so you're not respraying leaves. They say look for the glistening on the leaf, but in South Texas, it's so hot that you often don't have a glisten for very long. So blue dye is very important to use as a marker to make sure you're applying the chemical correctly, and to make sure you're not retreating trees that you've already done earlier. So the next application is stem spraying. When you stem spray a plant, you can do up to a 4 to 6 inch diameter in tree. 4 inches if the bark is really thick, probably a 6-inch diameter tree if the bark is a little bit thinner. You're going to apply that chemical mix to about 18 inches high all the way around down to the ground. I typically spray one side, walk around, and spray the other side of that tree. We only suggest a stem spray when you have 3 or less stems. So if you look at that tree over on the right hand side there, this is not a good candidate for a leaf spray. The reason being that you could spray all of those stems up to 18 inches, which would take a lot of chemical mix. But if you have a bud that is, let me see if I have a picture of it. Yeah, if you have a bud that is in between some of those stems, that chemical may not consistently get transferred down to the bud zone, and that tree will regrow from that bud. And so you've done all this work and the tree's not even killed. So very important that you hedge your bets and only do a stem spray if you have 3 or less stems. I really like stem spray for seedling trees, and what's really nice is if you can graze a pasture before you're going to treat it, graze it, and then they'll remove some of that forage from around the seedling tree so you can see it better, and apply that chemical to the seedling before it ever becomes a problem in your pastures. I think that's the best application, but a lot of people like stem spray because you can do it any time of year. Now keep in mind, with a stem spray or a leaf spray, you've got to leave that tree standing in the pasture for at least how long?
A year?
Sure.
I like to see who's uncomfortable with silence. They're usually the people that finally are like, fine. Yeah, you need to leave that tree standing for at least a year. If you remove it sooner, there's a good chance that that chemical has not completely killed the bud zone. So we're not worried about cracking the tree over on the top. We're worried about that bud zone still being active and that tree resprouting from one of the buds. So definitely leave it for a full year, if not 2. So you're gonna have to look at the skeleton. For a leaf spray, we do suggest, like I said earlier, an X1, or I usually use an X2 because I'm a little bit impatient, but it's a smaller hole and it's gonna put out a stream that's gonna be directed right onto the stem, so you're not wasting any of your chemical mix. All right, the mix for a stem spray is really easy. It's just Remedy Ultra or Triclopyr generic in diesel, and you simply put your chemical in the jug, you put the diesel up to the amount you're mixing, and then you shake it up real good. You do need a blue dye. That'll help mark which trees you've already treated. Again, at just 0.5 ounces per gallon of mix. But you don't need a surfactant because the diesel is what's getting that carrier, is what's acting as the carrier to get that chemical into the tree trunk. Now, the last treatment type we're going to talk about is cut stump treatment. Cut stump is more labor up front, but it is really nice because you're removing that skeleton. You don't have to look at that for a year. It's almost 100% effective if you do it correctly. And you can do it any time of year. So I always suggest people, you know, I don't know how it's going to work out with a pandemic going on, but you could invite people over for dinner, and then suddenly you've got all your equipment set up to do cut stump in the pasture, and just ask them for an after dinner activity if they'd like to help you out. You can cover a lot of area if you've got one person cutting followed by one person spraying. So think about 2 teams of people moving through a pasture. You can cover a lot of land very quickly. If you've got a lot to do, you could always rent a shear. These shears, like you see on the left there, they cut pretty big trees. You're not limited on size with cut stump, but you do need a pretty flat, clean cut. You need to make sure that when they're moving that tree away from your cut stump, that it's not kicking any dirt up onto that cut stump surface, or the chemical mix is not going to get in good contact with the cut stump. My favorite thing for cut stump is a brush cutter, which some of you may actually own. It's like a weed eater with a brush attachment on the end. Mine with handlebars, the smallest one I could find with handlebars, cost about $350. The blades actually cost about $40. So I would suggest buying a file. They make files specifically for the different blades. And if you file it, you can get a lot more use out of each blade. Some of these shears are actually mounted with a sprayer on them, but be sure you make sure that people are spraying a clean cut stump surface if you hire this out, because if there's anything keeping it, then they're all going to grow back the next year, or probably you're going to see it in 2 years and you're going to be pretty upset with them, and it will already have been 2 years since they were on your property.
Dr.
So, oh, go ahead.
We have a question. what type of sprayer is recommended to apply remedy with diesel? Because the diesel can foul up some of the pump type sprayers.
You're right. So if you're going to mix a large quantity, I would be very careful with what pump you use. And I wish I could find it. A guy a while back who had a business, he had one pump he knew of that worked fairly well with diesel. So when you call your spray company, you're going to want to ask specifically for something that can handle diesel. But personally, I even have specific sprayers, just pump up sprayers that I use with diesel, and they don't go in my good backpacks that I use for my leaf applications because I don't want the chance those leaking on me. So definitely keeping good, clean equipment, using maybe an ammonia mix, a 1% ammonia mix to clean your equipment when you're done will be important. But as far as those broadcast or bigger sprayers, I honestly wouldn't even do it. But if you're going to do it, then you need to make sure you find a pump that's compatible with diesel. And we're going to talk about something else here in a minute that's pretty exciting on the stem and cut stump world that might help fix that. That's what I'm saying. All right, so when you do a cut stump, you're cutting that tree off as low and as flat to the ground as possible, and you have to spray the entire cut stump surface and any remaining stem. So this guy here on the left, this is what my trees look like when I do with a chainsaw, which is why I don't typically use a chainsaw because it's hard on my back to keep bending over and over again. He has to treat all of those cut stump surfaces and all that remaining stem. So that tree was really a better candidate for a leaf spray. Too many stems to deal with, and he did not cut them low enough to save his chemical mix. People always ask me, how soon after I cut that stump do I have to actually apply the chemical? I say immediately for two reasons. One, we know over time the environment will start to close up that cut stump surface, and it won't be as vulnerable to taking in the chemical mix. Also, it's very, very hard to find the cut stump if you have any forage. So I usually cut and hold my boot there until the person with the sprayer can come spray it, or vice versa. And then if you have 2 or 3 stumps right there that you cut, you need to tell them there's 3 stumps they need to find, or that plant will be back. So good coordination is important. That's hard to do if you're going to cut a bunch and go back and find them. What they did is they tagged a bunch of cut stumps in a field, and they went back after 1 year, and it looked like maybe when they waited 4 hours later to spray, looked like they were still getting 85% control. But what happened is they went back 2 years later, and they noticed that all those trees were coming back. So after about the first 15 minutes, we know that your efficacy, or your ability to kill that plant, decreases rapidly. So with all the work involved in cutting off that tree, it would be definitely to your advantage to spray it immediately after cutting to make sure you get the biggest bang for your buck and your effort of removing the tree.
Dr. Clayton?
Yes.
As far as on the surface of the cut, is that, I guess I'm talking about the amount of chemical that, or herbicide that needs to be applied. Is it basically just on the surface of the cut, or does it need to soak in to the soil surface into the root system? Or?
No, you do not need to put it on the land at all. Okay. So we say the entire cut stump surface. In reality, you need to make sure that that cambium layer, or when you cut off the tree, that white ring where underneath the bark, it's moving its xylem and phloem. So that's what's feeding the plant. And you want to make sure that that's covered really well. But a lot of times it's very hard to make sure you just covered the right section. So we say cover the entire cut stump, no matter how big it is. Just spray the whole cut stump. And that's trying to get consistent movement of that chemical down to the bud zone. So if you've left any stem on that tree, go ahead and squirt it on the stem too. But no need to let it puddle up on the ground or to spray it on the ground around there. That tree is going to work for you, moving that down to the bud zone. Because remember, even though you cut it off, it's going to try to regrow. So you're just suppressing that plant from growing and then eventually killing that tree. So those stumps will break down over time, but they will take a couple of years to fully break down. That's why we say cut it as low and as flat to the ground as possible, but you don't want to leave any sawdust or dirt on that cut stump surface when you spray. When that tree is not sprayed well, like if you miss a stump or if it's slanted and that chemical runs off the high point, like in that right side picture, that tree will regrow from that side, and we know it has because it's got multiple stems. So I can't tell you how many times people have told me, I did cut stump, but now I have seedlings coming back, and all their seedlings are multi-stemmed. So I know they're tied to that same original huge root system underneath the ground. So that's an indication that you did not get good coverage or you missed that plant. But cut stump, again, can be done any time of year. So no need to go out when it's extremely hot outside, because it is a lot of work removing the top of that plant. But it's something that you can do in the downtime in the cooler weather and really clean up a lot of pastures beautifully. I've seen it done a lot of times. The mix for cut stump is very similar to stem spray, except you're opening up that entire cut stump surface. So instead of suggesting 25% triclopyr or Remedy Ultra, I would say you could just spray 15% triclopyr or Remedy with 85% diesel. And again, put that blue dye in there to make sure you're covering it well, and no surfactant. So if you're thinking that's really awesome that you went through all those individual plant treatments, but I've got too much brush to be doing individual plants, we do have broadcast control options for range and pasture, including with a boom. If you can get your boom at least 18 inches over the tallest part of the tallest plant you're trying to control, or a boomless nozzle like in this picture. This is my old four-wheeler rig. Has a boom buster nozzle on it, which shoots an arc out about 20 feet, probably a 16-foot effective swath width. And if you can get that 18 inches over the tallest part of your plant you're trying to control, like these Weesach I'm spraying right here, then that's very effective. Or if they're too tall, then you might have to go aerially, and you can do that with a fixed wing or a helicopter. Helicopter is going to be a little bit more on the application side, but can get in tighter areas and avoid non-target trees more than a helicopter or more than a plane could, of course. But know that anytime you invest in this broadcast application, you're going to want to come back or save some of your management dollars the next year and the next year for individual plant control. Because even on the best broadcast applications, we're happy if we get 70-75% control of those trees. So you're going to have some trees left that you'll want to go back and either cut stump or follow up with a secondary method to make sure that you're getting the biggest bang for your buck and the most longevity of forage production for that pasture. So on treatment mix calculations for individual plant treatments, people are going to give you a percentage, like the 1% Sendero. And that just means that you're going to put in 1% of 128 ounces. That's the only number you need to know, 128 ounces per gallon. So you times that by 1%, 1 divide by 100, and that's how I get the 1.28 ounces per gallon for Sendero. On a broadcast scale, we know you're going to put the same amount of chemical out over the entire acre, no matter how many or how big your trees are. So we can give you on a per acre basis to mix in your bigger tanks. And so it might be like 32 ounces per acre. So that's a broadcast treatment recommendation. So make sure, depending on what treatment type you're going to do, make sure that you're getting the right recommendation for that. And again, we have a brush buster series that I'll give you my website at the end, and they're all on my website. You can download those as a PDF from there. But they're for each individual plant species. We have one for prickly pear, and of course a separate one for cut stump that goes for a lot of different tree species. And then we call this kind of like our chemical Bible, but it's the chemical weed and brush control reference guide, and also referred to as our 1466. That's just the publication number. This guide has every weed and brush application in it that we have data on. So some things are just low effectiveness, but it gives you a lot of good information, a lot of good ammo for why or why not you would do some treatment for your problem brush or weed species. This is also the book that NRCS uses to determine if they can cost share applications. So if you'd like a copy of that, the newest one that just literally came out this month can be found on my website that I'll give you here at the end. Okay, so in our last, looks like 12 minutes, I'm going to very quickly run through some new herbicides that you're going to be hearing about for range and pasture. Very exciting that we even have these available in range and pasture, because it's very few and far between when we get new stuff for us. The first one is Mesaview, which some of you have probably heard of. It's known for its prickly pear control, and what's different from Toradon 22K that we used to recommend is that Mesaview works a little bit faster. So we see faster visual activity as far as yellowing and desiccation of those prickly pear pads. It's a potential post-emergent control of a number of other species. In particular, I'm doing research on it for old man's beard. We don't have a good recommendation for old man's beard right now, but Mesaview seems to be kind of our ticket for that one. And then it has oak recovery similar to Toradon. So you would spray that over your oaks if you're going to do an aerial application when the oaks are about to lose their leaves anyway. And then typically oaks come back like you see with Toradon. So here's an example. There's an untreated prickly pear from a pasture, Toradon 22K, where it's starting to yellow. This is how much? 4 months after treatment, and Mesaview is really starting to turn. So it just seems to act a lot faster, and in individual plant treatment applications, it's a lot more consistent than we've seen with other chemicals. So here is an example from broadcast applications. In the green is Mesaview, and you can see we've got anywhere from just below 70 to up to 85% control, and this line is the average. And then this blue is Toradon, and so it's not very far behind, actually. The advantage would be in the end, this is 24 months, so 2 years after. The advantage is that this Mesaview was probably dead a little bit sooner than the Toradon. With individual plant treatments, we see more consistency with Mesaview treatments. So you see that the range of values across all sites is very small, all above 90% control with Mesaview. And Toradon is a little bit more all over the board. Some places we got closer to 40% control, some places closer to 80% control. So for IPT, we are seeing that in addition to being faster, Mesaview is a little bit more consistent. So here's a picture of my clematis control. This is down in the Lolita area. This dark green right here is all old man's beard growing over the buffalo grass in the field. And this section right here is where I broadcast sprayed Mesaview. So this was 1 year after treatment, and a pretty impressive control effort for just 1 year later. So it's actually 3 herbicides or 3 active ingredients that we've used before in range and pasture: aminopyrrolid, which was Milestone, and picloram and fluroxapyr, which is actually Surmount. It is a restricted use herbicide. It's still got that picloram in there. It's running about $100 to $105 per gallon. It comes in both 30-gallon drums and 1-gallon jugs. And as a cost comparison, if I was going to do IPT, if you're just interested in what's cheapest, I would still tell you to do Surmount at 1%, because Surmount is only $58 per gallon, and you're still going to put out 1% of that, 1% of Toradon, or 1% of Mesaview. And so you can see that Mesaview is almost twice the cost of Surmount. So the benefit would be a little bit better control maybe, and faster, but still a lot cheaper going with Surmount. Toradon 22K is the cheapest herbicide broadcasted at $70 per gallon. But again, if you're interested in having quicker results, then Mesaview will be your pick. You can use Mesaview on rangeland, permanent grass pastures, and hayed and grazed land. Hay from the preceding 18 months is limited to use on farm or ranch, but there's a supplemental label that goes through May 30th, and I guess I would expect that to be renewed, but I have not seen that yet. Grazing livestock have a 3-day clean out before you move them to areas that are sensitive with broadleaves, and of course you cannot use manure in compost. So if you have some livestock that you might pick up some of the fecal material to use, say, in gardens, not a good idea, because it will kill all of your garden. Duracor, that's another chemical that's brand new on the market for range and pasture. It's a broad spectrum herbicide. It has a very environmentally friendly profile. In fact, it's won some awards. Very low use rates, low odor. You can mix it with fertilizer or it can be impregnated. And you get extended control of 140 plus weeds with grass safety. Woo. The active ingredients are new. It's Rinskor, and that's mixed with aminopyrrolid, that same thing that we saw earlier, the old milestone. It's a non-restricted herbicide, so anyone can purchase and apply this, and it has no 2,4-D or dicamba, so there's no concerns over those chemicals. It did win the 2018 Green Chemistry Challenge Award. It runs for $95 per gallon, but remember I said that it has a low use rate, so that's not really comparable apples to apples when you look at Grazon Next or Grazon P+D. I hope that makes sense. So you'll put out a lot less of this. So even if it's more expensive, it's not going to be this much more expensive. And then of course, Grazon Next and P+D, you need a license to apply. You can use Duracor on rangeland, permanent grass pastures, and hay and graze areas. Hay is limited to only use on ranch where it was sprayed, but it has a supplemental label through November of 2022, allowing you to move it off site. You do still have that same 3-day clean out, and you cannot use manure and compost. If you want additional information about Duracor, you can visit their website right down here. It does have some buffer information. Definitely read the label. You can't spray more than 10 feet above aerially, or safe height aerially, or 4 feet from the plants if you're doing a ground application. You have to have a half swath width displacement at the downwind edge of your field. And of course, winds can't be over 10 miles per hour, and they want you to use a coarse or coarser droplet size. The last chemical I want to cover very quickly. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay, Invora. Invora is what I'm super excited about. Years of anticipation. I've been researching this chemical since I started in this position a decade ago. What we found is Invora works really, really well on a number of mixed brush species, including Weesatch when it's broadcasted. And currently, we don't have a broadcast application recommendation for Weesatch that's any good. So pretty cool that we can get long-term control. And a lot of their plots, they even looked out to 10 years on mesquite and found that it was still maintaining fairly open land. Pretty amazing chemical. IPT leaf applications are available for things that we never had a leaf application recommendation for, like Texas mountain laurel, whitebrush, lotebush, coiltillo, agarito, Texas persimmon, and yaupon. So kind of a revolutionary thing for range and pasture, in my opinion. Also, what I told you I would refer to later on is that this chemical is going to be able to be applied as a stem and a cut stump treatment in water. So you'll use like a 1% MSO, methylated seed oil, in water to apply those. And so that would eliminate the need for diesel, which would open up the application for you that want to mix up large quantities and use it in, an electric pump situation. Might make that a little bit easier. So here's an example of Weesatch trials. There were 5 different trials over a 3-year period, and 10-year trial that they looked at 8.5 years even later. And here's the Invora herbicide plots in green. And these were the traditionally used chemicals, at least for that time. And you can see the canopy cover. Here's honey mesquite, even 8.5 years later, is still at 2%. Whereas in the other plots, it had already grown back to 25%. So the good control you get initially helps to keep those plots open for a longer period of time. And so it's a bigger investment long-term in your property for maintaining open lands. So the active ingredient is aminocyclopyrrolachlor, and it's mixed with triclopyr, which is the same thing as Remedy Ultra, but it's an amine formulation. So an ester is what our traditional Remedy Ultra is. Esters tend to volatilize a little bit more. They have a little bit more movement, but this one is including a triclopyr amine. EPA just literally issued a grazing label after years and years of trying by first DuPont and now Bayer. It is a restricted herbicide. It is TDA approved for Texas registration, and it will be put out this year, but mostly by aerial applicators because it's only being sold this year in 30-gallon drums. So the reason for this slow rollout is because they want to make sure that this chemical is used in the proper way. They don't want it to get into any trouble, like a similar, the same active ingredient was released in the turf grass market and it killed trees on golf courses. Of course, we want it in range and pasture to kill trees, but know that it's a very active ingredient. And so it's very important that people understand how to properly apply that. And the best way to do it is to ensure more education, which is what EPA did. They required an extra training, much like we're seeing in the farm world with dicamba. You're going to have to do a picolinic acid training. Those will soon be offered all over, but if you're interested in buying a 30-gallon drum and getting going this year, you'll need to contact Bayer, and I'll give you the website to put your information in to get the appropriate training through them this year. This is in addition to having your pesticide applicator's license and the continuing education that you need, although the training can also count as a laws and regs CEU if you'd like for it to do that. Prior to application on rangeland, you have to complete this training, and it's good for 2 years. So you'll have to renew it every 2 years. So if you're not going to buy a 30-gallon drum, I would wait until next year or later this fall to get your training, and we'll start advertising those a little bit more readily. The certified applicator has to keep record of training for 3 years. And again, that's just an added thing to be able to use this specific herbicide. So where can you use Envora? On privately owned, non-hayed rangeland and grassland. So you will never be able to use Envora on hayed property. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to allow that. There's no movement of harvest, compost, manure, or vegetation for 2 years following the treatment. So everything that's sprayed has to remain on site, basically. So brush has to degrade on site. You can't move the manure off of that site. And the grazing livestock, just like those other chemicals that we went over, have a 3-day clean out. And just to explain that a little bit more, that means before you move it to land that's either not yours or that you wouldn't want this application to be, have pooped on, then you're going to have to put them in a pen and feed them basically, or move them to a pasture that was not sprayed for 3 days. So just something to consider. If you sell to like the 4-H and FFA market, if you have show animals, then you'll need to keep those in a pen for 3 days before you give them to that 4-H'er, because they may not understand the composting rules behind that. And it's your responsibility to make sure that that label is followed. So additional information, there are some buffers. You can only spray broadcast up to 100 feet within your fence line, but you can do individual plant treatments all the way up to the fence line and on that fence line. And there's some other rules as far as water, depending on if that water is moving off your property or if it's contained on your property. But for more information, go to envora.com. You can even put in your information in a contact. You'll be contacted by Bayer representative in order to get you more information about that product. But we'll be rolling out some more educational opportunities and information on getting your hands on Envora later this year. So here's my email address if you have any questions for me. Also, my South Texas Rangelands.tamu.edu website has a tab called Publications, and that's where you can download all the publications I covered today and some other really handy ones, like all the herbicides that you can use in range and pasture and the limitations on those, or if you need a pesticide license for those. And then if you're on Facebook, go ahead and like us on Texas Range Extension. We do a couple of posts a week, and we publicize our webinars on there. So lots of good stuff coming out on Texas Range Extension Facebook page. Was that the only question that came through chat box, Marco?
I believe so. Yeah, let me double check here.
Y'all are easy.
Yeah, that was it.
Great.
And I guess now
I have a question, Megan.
Okay.
Real quick, do you have data comparing Sendero 1% to Sendero 2%?
We do somewhere. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's not necessary. So it pretty much tops out at a really high percentage at 1%.
Yeah,
If
okay.
we do actually, we had 0.75% actually worked out fairly well too. But 1% is a little bit easier as far as remembering, and also it
Right.
was a little bit more consistent than the 0.75%.
Got
So
it.
I definitely would never suggest that somebody go above 1%. But if they went a little bit less, they might be okay, but that's definitely not the recommendation.
Got it. Thank you.
If you're interested in picking up other mixed brush, then you could always add in something like Remedy or Tordon, and that might help. But we had fantastic control ratings with 1% Sendero, and it's more consistent than Remedy and Reclaim, the old mixture that we used to use for decades on mesquite.
Right. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Um,
Everybody hungry?
everybody might be hungry.
Me too.
Yeah. Let me see. Annette's sending me a message real quick before. Let me see. Reminding participants that they can log in to the same credentials. That means I guess we're going to take a little lunch break, and I guess we'll log off. And if everybody can just log back in, I guess around 12:55, maybe 1 o'clock, we should hopefully get started with Mr. Jose Martinez there with his talk on pasture establishment and management. If there's no further questions, Dr. Clayton, thank you very much. Very informative. Perfect timing too, by the way. Shoot, 2 hours. You did really good.
I
Right
try.
on time. So thanks again very much for presenting to us. And we will definitely be back, I guess, in about an hour. If everybody can log back in right close to 1 o'clock, we'll get started again with Mr. Martinez.
Thank you.